It's the ML Sports Platter, brought to you by Elevate Fitness of Syracuse, Burn Dairy, and Liverpool Physical Therapy. You need that PT, head on over to Liverpool Physical Therapy, a proud sponsor of the ML Sports Platter. I bring on the author of this amazing book in my hands. Go get it online where books are sold and your nearby bookstores. It's called The New York Game, Baseball and the Rise of the New City, with Babe Ruth right there on the cover. Kevin Baker, my man, I am so honored to have you on the show, and I love this book. I couldn't put it down. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much, Mike. Thanks for having me on, and that's great to hear.
So this book ends with this.
Yeah.
Yet there were a few who recognized a hollow spot in the victory, a lingering wound that had to be dressed, both in New York and in the country as a whole. No longer would commission reports and rallying against rumors and snake agitators serve. In the new post-war world, something would have to be done to make all of New York's people true citizens if the city was to survive. That change was coming, and baseball would play a small but vital role in making it happen. And I didn't expect the book to end this way. I read it all the way through, 474 or 5 pages. Before that, we're talking about the growth of the boroughs. We're talking about the growth of Harlem and all these other different things. Jackie Robinson, right? Jackie Robinson, baseball, segregation, and all that. That's the step that you're talking about from here to there, right? That's what that paragraph means?
Exactly. And Jackie Robinson will be on the cover of the second book, which will be out in the spring of 2026.
Perfect.
It's pretty much done. Needs to be edited and I guess updated a little bit.
All right.
But it's that's very much kind of the turning point. I had turned in this enormous, oversized manuscript, which my editors at Knopf were very good about dealing with. And in the end, they decided the best thing was to cut it in half. And really 45 seemed like the great place, because that is the moment America comes out of this enormous, horrifying war that is a lot about racism. That's about racial theories and fascism and all this. And we have defeated that ideology. But then what do we have at home? And we still have Jim Crow. We still have all this terrible racism. And that has got to change. And it's got to change in America as a whole, but also in New York City and in baseball. And that will be part of what the second book is about, a large part.
From the beginning of this book until that point I just mentioned, though, you have everything. You have Willie Mickey and the Duke. You have Babe Ruth. You have Muggsy McGraw, who went to St. Bonaventure, by the way, which is where I went to college. You have Christy Mathewson. You've got the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Bums and all these boroughs and the growth. And you have the growth of the city, which is a big part of it, where you try to line up New York baseball and New York, the city, you know, the construction and the erection of all these amazing buildings and the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building and all these things. And we're going back now, you know, even when baseball had all these little mini teams in the boroughs before, right? Babe Ruth and all that. So at what point do you think New York City, the way it looks, not now, but then when you're writing about the book, when it really came about, when it went bang, here's New York, and baseball went bang, we're baseball. This is the sport of New York, and New York is New York, right? It all comes together. When was that, right? Building, construction, moments, monuments, buildings, baseball, and it all right there that first time it went together.
Well, I think in some ways its peak, or at least the New York we think of as New York, was that New York that came about in the 30s and 40s. I mean, baseball really was the New York game. It was baseball as we know it today, really did evolve in New York and was written down in the New York rules. And that won out over dozens of other bat and ball games Americans used to play. But as for New York and baseball coming into its own, it's really this sort of so-called golden age from really the 30s into the 50s, when the city it's physically beautiful. It's more than ever before a city for everyone. I keep making out in this book talking about how there's the big city and the little city in New York. The big city, the leader in international finance and fashion and glamour and what have you. But the little city, that's thousands of individual neighborhoods. And very rarely have the two been in sync in the city's history. And this is the period probably where they were most in sync, because you had FDR and the New Deal, you had Fiorello LaGuardia making the city more than it ever had been about working class people, about middle class people. But there were still huge unanswered issues. And, if you were a woman in this society, your options were very limited. If you were a person of color, your options were very limited and you faced intense prejudice. So all of that is going to have to change too. And that's a lot of what the second book will be about. And, it changes in bad ways. New York's always sort of where, more than any place else, New York, I think, is really the heartland of America. It's where we have really fought out, often in the streets, just who is going to be an American and what that means. And it's a question that's still under debate today. But New York is often where it has been decided. And while it's often a tough process, a slow process, even a bloody process, we keep expanding that definition, which is all the better, I think.
There were all those little leagues, though, that you talked about in the book. Like, I think especially in Brooklyn, where they had like kind of their own. It almost reminded me of like a beer softball league kind of thing.
Yeah.
It was like all these different teams, and they were like these micro leagues and this and that. So Brooklyn played a big part, but you had Brooklyn
is
Bronx,
huge.
you have Manhattan, you have Long Island, you have all these suburbs of these boroughs, I should say, of New York. Somebody would kill me for saying suburbs, but boroughs of New York. Was there a borough that in the early days now of baseball that was more impactful than the others, in your opinion, in terms of the development to get us to, the Willie, Mickey, and the Duke and Joe D and all those decades of glorious New York baseball time? Was there a borough that was up here?
I'd say more than any, Brooklyn, where like a lot of the great players came from very early on. But it's really Brooklyn and Manhattan that were the center of it. However, there have been major league teams in every borough in New York, even briefly on Staten Island.
Yeah.
And the suburbs are part of it too. The actual suburbs, as you say, Hoboken, which is where they went across the river on the steam ferries and played a lot of games at the Elysian Fields.
Yeah.
So this was all over the New York area. And as you say, they had industrial leagues all over the place. At work, you got on this, you played on your work team, you played in these industries. You also had the people who were excluded from the big league game, black ball players playing on these black New York teams, Hispanic players playing on really what were great New York teams, the New York Cubans and Cuban Stars, the New York Lincoln Giants, great black team. So you really had baseball going on all over the place. This was really the hotbed of it, right around the New York area.
I couldn't believe when I read about those Lincoln Giants that it was Vince McMahon's.
Yes,
right. It was his, if I can remember correctly, his grandfather, right, and it was a grand uncle,
and like great uncle,
a great uncle and a grandfather who owned that team.
Oh yeah. They were these promoters, and there were a lot of
white. Where he got it from?
Oh yeah, and there were a lot of white promoters running around promoting black athletes in different things. So like Nat Strong, I think, with the Globetrotters in basketball, they sponsored some of these early black baseball teams. The Lincoln Giants, probably one of the greatest teams, man for man, ever assembled. Sure. Period. You got Oscar Charleston, Spotswood Poles, Louis Santop, Pop Lloyd, a couple of great pitchers, Cannonball, Dick Redding, and but these were tremendous players, and they were playing on these horrible looking sort of sandlot fields that a high school team wouldn't play on today up in Harlem. That's what they were relegated to, and that's one of the great shames of segregation in America, as it is in anything. Yes, most horrible for the players involved who couldn't get into the majors and couldn't reap the rewards of how great they were. But terrible for all of us. We didn't get to see them. Didn't get to see them play against the Babe Ruths and the Ty Cobbs. When they did in exhibition games, they played very well and won most of those games, according to most accounts. So this is really a shame. On the other hand, it's also an inspiring story. The African Americans, as they did in other parts of the society, found a way where there was no way, and found a way to make their own leagues and make their own game, and contributed a great deal to what became, Major League Ball as it evolved.
It's called The New York Game, Baseball and the Rise of a New City. Our guest is Kevin Baker, is the author. Major bookstores and online like Amazon.com, where you can get books. I would go buy it right now if I were you, baseball and sports fans. And part 2 is coming, but part 1 is absolutely amazing, and you got to go read it word for word like I did. I know it's hard to take one guy because they were all legendary players. Christy Mathewson and Babe Ruth, and you can go Lou Gehrig and Willie Mays and Duke Snyder and the Mick, your guy growing up. But if you had to take one player, and I know part 2 is coming, so you have the late 40s and the 50s still to go. I get that.
Yeah.
But there's a few of those guys I mentioned here. Lou Gehrig, how about him? If you had to take one guy to represent the new, you know what? Let's keep it at this book, because part 2 will have some of the other ones I mentioned.
Sure.
So Mays and Mantle you can't pick because they didn't play till 51 was their first year. So this would have Joe D and Ruth and some others. If you had to take one guy to represent what this is, the growth right here where baseball rises. Is it Joe D with a connection to the Italian Americans? Is it Babe because he's the Babe? Is it the New York boy who went to Columbia in Lou Gehrig?
Yeah.
What is it? McGraw because of his style and ruggedness, and he's as raw as New York is at that time. Who do you pick to represent this right here?
There are so many guys, as you say, and I hope I've told great stories about all of them, and people really enjoy it. Christy Mathewson's amazing. Even way back before the Civil War, a guy named James Creighton, who had a legendary kind of thing, and really it was like the end of the natural. He actually had some inner organ that burst while he was rounding the bases in his last home run and died. Amazing story. You can't make this stuff up. But the person who most exemplifies this era, I have to say, is Babe Ruth. And it's hard to say Babe Ruth, we all know about it. We don't really. And I feel he's the most transformational athlete in history. Certainly more people around the world know who Michael Jordan is, or Muhammad Ali, or Lionel Messi, or anybody. But Ruth really transformed baseball into big time. He brought the Yankees into the Yankees when the year he came, drew the first 1 million person gate period. Before this, baseball made about as much money as the sheet music industry.
Right.
And Ruth really transforms that. It was like the person and the time and the place and the owner, Jacob Rupert, were met. And this was perfect. And Ruth is he's such an unbelievable, as one of his teammates said, all the lies about Babe Ruth are true, among other things. He ate, sure, he drank. All ball players drank.
Roaring 20s, though. He was the Roaring 20s. There's the famous picture of him with the crown on him.
Yeah.
With a cigar, that is Babe in the 20s, there, right?
He'd go play all the exhibition games. Sure. He never had really a day off. One of the weirdest things about him was he apparently used to chug pitchers of iced tea. The tea, the ice cubes, the lemon slices, and I don't know how a human being does that. But one of the best stories about him, I think, to give you an idea of how huge he was in the public imagination, in those days, the Yankees would play the then Philadelphia Athletics down at Shibe Park in Philly. And they would get off at the North Station in Philly and get off and walk the last few blocks to the park. And where we'd go out, Babe Ruth is coming, and adults would run to the windows, and little kids would run out there and jump on him. And he'd usually end up carrying 2 or 3 kids to the ballpark at the end. He was a great legend at a time when you could still have legends in America.
Yeah, way, way, way before social media. And, it was perfect for his time. It was also a white game, though. And you mentioned that with the no segregation. We talk about numbers. We talk
Yeah.
about comparing the greats of all time. I'm a big proponent that when you start talking about the Ruths and the Jordans and all these people, Jim Brown, I think no matter what era it is, if they did what they did in their era and they were dominant and they're at the elite, I mean, we're talking, Tiger Woods, Jack Nicklaus, etc. If you're up at that top level, you're going to figure it out and be elite in any era. Even in an era of basketball where the centers disappeared, I think Bill Russell dominates because he would figure out a way because he was that elite, right? But you have to think now, when all the Negro League stats are finally coming in and the Negro Leagues are getting all the respect now finally that they're due all through the years. And, you go talk to Bob Kendrick, you talk to anybody you want. Oscar Charleston, Josh Gibson, all these guys, Satchel Paige, Cool Papa Bell, flip the lights off. He's in bed before the lights are off. You hear all the stories. Lloyd was Babe Ruth. He said he was the greatest player he saw. All of them would have succeeded. They would have been bona fide, great, elite Hall of Fame players in the major leagues. So I ask you this question. If there was segregation, how does it change Ruth's career? Because and with pitching, fastballs, maybe there were a couple other ones, but come on, the day today, splitter, curveball, slurs, all kinds of stuff. So the pitching and the segregation maybe impacts him. I still think he's great. He's elite. He's probably Mount Rushmore, but it had to have had an impact, right?
Well, very interesting that what you bring up, and it's an interesting argument that's been going on. I love it. That's one of the great things about baseball. In terms of segregate, well, first of all, Babe Ruth may have been black or partly black. That was a continuing rumor.
Right.
It gets gross fast when you try to prove it or not prove it, but it may, which I think would be, I'd love it if we could know it was true. It'd be the ultimate irony that the best player slipped by the color line, horrible as that was. From recorded games, which were when they were between blacks and whites, were often usually played very seriously. Ruth hit something like 440 something against black pitchers. Yeah. I mean, he hit everybody. Of course, if the game were integrated too, who is to say that the Yankees wouldn't have had a number of great black players? Including maybe the best black pitchers. So maybe he wouldn't, game would have been unaffected by that. Impossible to know, but I think he would have thrived in an integrated game as well. I've heard the stuff about the pitching, how much more complicated it is, and you bring in guys and they're whatever. On the other hand, every single player from that era went up there without a batting helmet, or, much less any kind of body armor. You went up there and somebody threw a fastball at your head, and that was only an 88 mile an hour fastball. You could die, and one did. Ray Chapman was killed by a pitch ball on the field of the Polo Grounds in 1920. So each period you were playing in wool uniforms. You were playing unair conditioned clubhouses
during the day.
Yeah, the Yankees played pretty much every day because of Ruth. They didn't have off days. They would go to whatever town would pay, and Ruth would be expected to maybe pitch the whole game. He would be expected to sign about 10,000 autographs. Kids would climb on him. He'd lead the local band. He'd do everything. So there was, all this sort of, you didn't have anything like modern conditioning. One of the things, one of the reasons Ruth got such a belly, he liked to work out a lot. He was probably ADD, so he was, he liked to work out in the off season. The Yankees put it in his contract. He was not allowed to even play golf. So his legs kind of atrophied. He got fatter. He played till he was 40 and played pretty well. So you wonder how long would he have played if he'd been allowed to work out, or if he'd had modern conditioning. I think in the modern sport, and this is just a guess, there's a guy, Bill Wilkinson, did an amazing job tracing his entire background, his every home run he hit, where it went, and also Ruth was playing in what were usually much more massive parks than we have today.
Sure.
I think today he probably would not have hit as high as 340, but I think he would have hit even more home runs. I mean, this guy Wilkinson estimates he would have hit over 1,000 home runs in today's game. I don't know if that's true, but I think it might have been.
Yeah, well, he did have 298 down the right field line though for 80, whatever it was, X amount of games. It was 100 and what 44 or 52 games. So give or take 72 games at home, and you can do all the
Well,
averages. You can
yeah.
lose your mind about all of it, but yeah, but the
Well,
parts, the deep parts were left and right center fields, and those parts were unread. You had to hit the ball 5 miles to get it out of the park.
he was not like that much of a pull hitter usually, but also another weird rule that must have applied only to him for years. For several years, the umpire could, if you hit the ball out of the park, the umpire was allowed to judge if it would have landed foul or fair. So there were actually home run balls you would hit out of the polo grounds,
Oh,
and they
man.
would go like, "Yeah, I think that when that comes down in Westchester, that would be
Yeah, right.
that would be a foul ball." Not so. There's always a constant back and forth. One thing Ruth did, though, that I wish we could restore to the game more, and I think this is the thing that maybe bugs me most about baseball more. He would bunt. I once bunted like 10 times in a month. They put a shift on him. He'd hit to the opposite field. He'd bunt.
Sure.
He'd do these other things. He was very good at, the game was played much more organically. I mean, I think we do probably need some rules like the pitch clock now, but I wish baseball would get back to solving its problems organically. Teach people to they put a shift, teach people to hit to the opposite field. The shift will stop. Pitchers can't go more than 5 innings. Teach them to pitch to contact. That will change. Though you'll have complete games again, which I miss. These are the sort of things. Instead, baseball, like all too much of America today, is just obsessed with certain statistics, certain analytics, and just abides by that. And it's making the game dull, and it's making the players one-dimensional.
Yep, no, I agree with that. And the previous thing about Ruth with me, with bringing up the, hey, if it was segregated, it's by no means to demean Ruth. It's an interesting way to. I wonder what would be. It's just so fascinating. Again, it's out there. The New York Game, Baseball, and the Rise of a New City. Amazon.com and nearby bookstores where books are sold. I got about 30 seconds or so with you here. I got another interview coming up. So tell me what you want people to say about this book when they get done reading it in 30 seconds.
I hope they read it and say, I did not know that about many, many things in it. I hope they say this opened my eyes to the way the game was played. And I also want them to say, I can't wait to read the next one. I'm counting the days.
You got at least one person who did that over and over and over again. And I didn't even know about the second one until you just told me about 20 minutes ago. People, go buy this book. It's amazing. Kevin Baker, thank you a million for coming on. You're the best.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Mike.